Hello, everybody. Happy summer solstice and a warm welcome to this webinar on taking a bite out of the climate crisis through regenerative agriculture, hosted by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78. The Group of 78, which I am privileged to chair, was founded in 1981, just over 40 years ago, and is a progressive forum for dialogue and advocacy on international affairs and Canadian foreign policy. Climate Legacy is a project of the Group of 78, initiated in 2019. Its purpose is to engage and mobilize older Canadians in climate action through their voice, their time, and their money. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm making these remarks from traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And I'd like to add that the work of Indigenous reconciliation is a responsibility of all Canadians, including those associated with the Group of 78 and Climate Legacy. This is the fourth in a series of webinars this year, co-hosted by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78, on the general theme of financing the transition, meaning the transition to a zero net carbon economy. The first three in the last several weeks were on the transition in energy, on greening the financial system, and on international climate finance. Today we are focusing on the transition in agriculture. We're pleased to co-sponsor this webinar with Farmers for Climate Solutions. We're planning a fifth webinar in this series in the fall, in a session on financing climate adaptation in municipalities. I might add that two recent Group of 78 webinars may be of interest to members of our audience today. On Tuesday, the 20th of June this week, we hosted a webinar on anti-inflation policy, green finance, and the climate crisis, featuring Tom Ferguson of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And on April the 6th, a few weeks ago, we hosted a webinar on the role of innovation and technology in feeding the future, featuring Evan Fraser from the University of Guelph. Video recordings are available for almost all of our past webinars, should anyone be interested. On to our webinar for today. According to Agriculture Canada, some 10% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are from crop and livestock production. At the same time, agriculture can help slow climate change by harmlessly storing carbon in the soil. This means that Canadian farms have the potential to go from carbon emitters to significant carbon sinks, part of the solution to climate change rather than part of the problem. Today, we will hear three Canadian farmers discuss how they are addressing the climate crisis on their own farms and collectively through organizations like Farmers for Climate Solutions. I'd like to welcome our three speakers, Tony McQuail from Ontario, Dana Penrice from Manitoba, and Blaine Hiertas, who's going to be our moderator from Southeast Saskatchewan. Blaine, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and our speakers and get the show rolling. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start out here sharing some pictures, I hope. That should come up full screen there now. Is that correct, Tony? So I have farmed this is my 49th year of farming. And of those, 25 of them have been regenerative. So half my career now, I've been a regenerative farmer, I guess. And so I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes about what I do on my farm, and then we'll carry on to the next one. So I'm very privileged that my farm was started by my grandfather over 100 years ago. And so every single screw up on that farm is attributed to my grandfather, my dad, myself, or my son. And so when my grandfather started, the soil was 12% organic matter. And by the time I started to change to a regenerative model, in places we had worked that down to 2%. So if you do some heavy duty math, there's a tremendous carbon legacy in the atmosphere from taking that carbon from the soil and putting it up by the way we farmed. So our salinity was increasing, nutrient density was decreasing, all sorts of things were happening. So this little graph right here, or picture, just kind of illustrates what happened. So what on the right-hand side is what my grandfather inherited from 10,000 years of bison grazing on the prairies. And it was black soil. And you can see when you look into that, very, very aerated, lots of space in there for roots, for water, for air to get in. And by tillage and various other things that we did in agriculture and are still doing today on most farms, we gradually moved it to what it looks like on the left. And you can see here, we have 1% organic matter. Here we have 10% organic matter. Here we have 60% space. Here we have 25% space. That's the key difference. For 10,000 years of agriculture, we've been moving soil from the right to the left. And it's only until very recently that we have learned how to actually take the soil on the left and begin to regenerate it and move it back to the right. And that is very exciting. So we have been destroying soil for about 10,000 years. And finally, we have figured out now how to reverse the process. So what we've missed in our approach is these green leaves here that capture sunshine. That's our free energy source. Photosynthesis creates sugar. And the sugar goes down into the roots, and it exudes out of the roots into this blue area right here called the rhizosphere, the area immediately around the roots. And the sugar goes out, and that seems kind of wasteful. Some plants, up to 70% of that sugar actually exudes out of the plant. But plants for 420 million years have had a synergistic relationship with the bacteria and the fungi. And so the plants feed the bacteria and the fungi, and in return, the fungi and the bacteria bring all of the essential things that the plants need. And so we have missed that in our modern approach to agriculture, much to our detriment, and our health is failing because of that. Here's just a chart from McCants and Widdowson. It's an English company. And you can just see the declines in the various minerals in the food in the various categories. You know, if I just pick one, we'll look at, say iron down here, 27% in vegetables over 60 years, 24% in fruit, 50% in meat, 83% in dairy. You know, and I don't want to belabor this. It's a more recent study, 2022. This is looking at regeneratively raised beef versus conventionally raised beef. And one of the things that we're learning is really critical to our health is the phytonutrients and those type of things that are in plants. And so just to take a look, we all hear about omega-3, omega-6s. Grass or regeneratively raised grass beef is 0.1. Conventional raised beef is 0.03. So almost 3 times more omega-3s in regeneratively raised beef than there is in conventional beef. And what do doctors tell us? We need to eat more salmon because it's high in omega-3. If you eat proper beef, it is every bit as good for us as salmon is. So what does regenerative agriculture mean? Well, it's really quite simple. They're the natural principles. If you go out and observe Mother Nature in a natural setting, you will find that these are the rules that Mother Nature follows. So the only one man-made one there is context, and that depends on what you're trying to do on your farm. But the 5 natural principles are keeping it green, keep that living root as long as possible, have diversity on this in your system, have armor or litter on the surface of the land to keep it covered, minimize your disturbance on the land, and have animals incorporated into the system. How it happens, every farm will be different. The principles are the same everywhere in the world. I talked about my farm and the destruction that we did over the 100 and odd years we've been on that piece of land. Well, this just shows that it's not just us. This is the world. We have desertified about 40% of the surface of the earth. This is just in a chart form here. We have 13 billion hectares of functioning ecosystem 10,000 years ago. This adds up to the same 13 billion, but we've had tremendous change because of agriculture. We've taken forest to 3.5 billion from 8. We've changed rangeland. We've taken 1 billion out, made it into crop, and we have created one new category called desert, 44 billion hectares of desert. And it's estimated that we have lost 50% of the photosynthetic capacity of the earth in the last 10,000 years. So this right here is the issue in climate, is the fact that we are no longer capturing as much sunshine and making things green. And so this just illustrates it very well. You know, here we have well-intentioned environmentalists. We move livestock off more arid type lands in the western part of the prairies here, southwestern United States, Australia, you know, various places, Africa, and so on. So they say cows are evil. Here we have cows properly managed on land, and you can see tremendous difference. So you think about this one here. You look at the last picture versus this one. This one has been chemical, synthetic fertilizer on it. This is monoculture cropping. And just think about the tremendous diversity that one had. Whoops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. This one here, just think about the diversity of insects, life, plants, all that stuff, the cooling effect it has versus this one here. This is modern industrial agriculture. The one above was agriculture, regenerative agriculture. And just think about that, which one is cooler. So with that, that's my little brief introduction. I am now going to ask Tony to just spend a couple minutes just talking about what he does on his farm, introduce himself. Go ahead, Tony.
Okay, thanks, Blaine. Well, I started farming a little over 50 years ago as a hired hand in 1973. I bought our farm. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures that relate to it. So I'll try and share my screen here. So when we bought the farm, this is what it looked like, this bare cornfield. And as Blaine mentioned, you're not getting any transfer of carbon dioxide from the air into the soil on a bare situation like that. In fact, you're probably losing soil organic matter and putting carbon dioxide up into the air. So that's what all the workable land on our farm looked at like in 1973. But then, oh, come on. There. This is what our farm looks like now. Those bushes there were on the border of the neighbor's field, but all our land is now covered with either perennial pasture, perennial hay, trees. We have several different varieties of orchard, apples and pears and plums. So we're growing a diversity of marketable crops, but also a diversity of plant material in our cropland, which creates a whole lot more life in the soil and has brought our soil organic matter up from what it probably was about 1.5% to 2% at the time we bought the farm to now 3% to 6%, depending on where you're sampling. And that's a great transfer of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the soil. And it's also meant a huge increase in the biodiversity on our farm, and then a variety of insects, the variety of birds, small mammals, large mammals that can call our farm home. And the interesting thing to me is that it doesn't necessarily reduce your productivity or yield. Many years ago, we had a CBC film crew here. They wanted to see organic potatoes because they were contrasting with genetically modified ones. But after they did the little interview in the garden, the sound guy took his boom out and he was just walking around. And he came back and he said, "I've never heard so much insect noise. I've never heard." I was just recording it for myself. And what I realized is we didn't have a pest problem. We just had a huge diversity of life out there on our farm. And it was not there when we started. The first year I plowed the farm because I didn't know about trying to minimize disturbance. And I had to because it had been left as corn stubble. And you never saw a worm. If you saw a worm, it was a really exciting thing. And now we have earthworms in great numbers, as well as many other arthropods. But when we look at what we got, we started with cash crop land. We now have perennial pasture, hay, and trees. But why did we do this? Well, the system wasn't working for us, the conventional system, and we wanted to do something different. And how we did it was we started putting everything into first a 7-year crop rotation with 5 years pasture and hay plants, and then 2 years of grain. And now we're entirely perennial plants, except for our own vegetable garden, and of course adding trees to it. But the other reason we were concerned about this was we were starting farming in 1973, and this was at the time of the Arab oil embargo, and I'd done some work at the University of Guelph where I took agricultural courses. And at that time, the research showed that modern industrial agriculture, which was supposedly so incredibly efficient, used about 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to put 1 calorie of food on the table. Now, it wasn't just agriculture, it's the whole system. So it's the production of the machinery, the refrigeration, and the marketing of the at the retail and all that. But we use a huge amount of energy to put a very small amount on the table. And yet the contrast with the pre-industrial agriculture was that they yielded between 5 and 50 calories of energy to the farmer and the community for every 1 calorie invested in agriculture. So we've been very good at substituting fossil fuel for labor and fossil fuel for thoughtful management, but we have been very poor at actually creating an efficient system if you look at the energy. And so for us, we wanted to figure out how we worked into a system that was more environmentally friendly and also more sustainable in the long run. And at the time, organic agriculture was the system that was flying in the face of industrial agriculture, the one that was saying, no, we've got to concentrate on the soil, we've got to look after things. And so we tried to design systems that had something growing and year round, or at least for all the time that you could be capturing sunshine in our part of Ontario. But the thing about agriculture, as I think about the climate crisis, is to me, agriculture is the incredibly low-hanging fruit in this situation. Because we're not just talking about reducing emissions, we're talking about the potential for a significant amount of soil sequestration as part of our regular operation of a regenerative farm. This isn't something new we've got to add. We don't have to get new technology. We don't have to do more research. We already know how to do this. And it's a transformation of how we manage things. And the other thing about it is that farmers have been making this transition on their own, often with that very little university or government support. So hopefully if we get it right and start getting universities trying to think about how do we maximize the solar conversion into soil organic matter and minimize the off-farm inputs and the disturbances that we've been doing in agriculture, we could make much faster progress. And again, if we get governments investing in the transition rather than the status quo, we can make, I think, great progress. But the other thing that's really important to recognize is that we all eat, and we're all part of the carbon cycle. We aren't going to eliminate carbon from agriculture because that's what we do. We capture carbon through photosynthesis and either turn it into food or fiber or building materials in terms of wood on our woodlots, or we put it back into the soil. And the thing about it is if we practice regenerative agriculture, we're really making an investment in our own success as farmers. Because as we create healthier soil, we need fewer inputs. We've got more resilience, both in our crop in the face of too much rain. That porous soil that Blaine showed you will absorb an awful lot of rainwater, where that other one is just going to run it off and erode away and cause flooding and downstream damage to municipalities and houses. And so there's a benefit if we get too much rain, but if we get too little, that soil has also absorbed and held, in the organic matter in that soil will have held a lot of moisture, which will help crops get through a drought period much more effectively. And so there are these incredible, what I call collateral benefits of making this transition to regenerative agriculture. And one of the things that to me has been exciting is the fact that farm organizations that at one time were kind of on the periphery of things because they weren't part of didn't massively support the industrial system, are now had come together And here's the group that have helped form Farmers for Climate Solutions. And so this is a cross-section of farm organizations across Canada that are saying, we can do better in agriculture, we can do more. And that we are part of the solution, and that we desperately need to adapt, because farmers are going to be not only on the cutting and leading edge of regenerative agriculture, but they're going to be very much on the bleeding edge of climate crisis. Because if we don't become more resilient and we don't create more better adapted farms, drought and flooding and all these other things that are part of the climate crisis package are going to have a huge impact on us individually and collectively. So this group of farm organizations here have come together in Farmers for Climate Solutions to help develop the willingness in government to make the transition and to support the transition and to encourage farmers, because many farmers are very much on a very narrow margin, and so change is risky. So if developing ways to help with that transition is really important. But to me...
Okay, Tony, you better quit here.
I better quit? Okay, I will.
Sorry. Okay, I'm going to ask Dana to introduce herself now.
Sure. Thanks so much, Tony. You can all see the passion that we all have for this topic. So it's, thanks for Blaine for moderating us. We need it. All right. So, and feel free to stop me as well. My name is Dana Penrose. I live and farm at Shoal Lake, Manitoba with my partner Ted and my in-laws. And we are in the Aspen Parkland ecoregion. So we kind of call this pothole country, where we've kind of got these open grasslands that are interspersed with lots of little ponds and sloughs and poplar bluffs. And on our land here, as we all are, we're on ancestral lands of many First Nations peoples. And I always like to recognize that, because I've really learned from Indigenous people that this is all about relationships. And one of the most important relationships that we have, whether we realize it or not, is our relationship to the land, and how we either as individuals or collectively as a society are managing that relationship with the land. We have a small creek that runs through our place that's called Arrow River, and it was called that because that's where the Saskatoon bushes were along the banks, and the Indigenous people use that for making arrows and hunting on this land. So during our short time on this earth, my partner and I, and his family, we use cattle and cropping to manage the land. And we are working to regenerate the ecology and habitat that makes up this land. And our farm is kind of unique because we still are a mixed farm. Most farms in Canada have been specialized into either cattle or grain or whatever the production is, which has been this trend over the past decades. Because of economic forces, we're getting farms that are bigger and bigger and bigger, and fewer people on the land with that direct relationship to the land. So how is climate change impacting us? I think, Tony talked about how farmers are becoming, we're at the bleeding edge of climate change affecting us. I'm seeing more and more of that happening to us, more and more weather events, extreme weather events. And on our farm, we haven't had it bad, but I know, hearing from a lot of other people across the prairies, there's just some devastating conditions out there. The Prairie Climate Center predicts that in our region, even under a low carbon scenario where emissions reduction has taken place, there will be 21 and a half more days above 30 degrees Celsius in these hot conditions, where plants and animals become stressed and production is affected. And we saw that this year. We had about 2 weeks of above 30 degrees in May already, and I was raising chickens at that time. And just because it was so hot, it stressed out those animals so much, I lost half of my chickens. And basically I was just reflecting the whole time about like, this is the time when the system breaks. It's really kind of devastating as a farmer for that to happen to you. I've, seen, we've seen these scenarios play out in BC, where in 2021, some farmers lost 75% of their crop due to heat waves. And I've heard things like it reduces fertility in animals because they just don't want to breed when the temperatures are hot. And then you don't really see that effect till next year when your calf crop comes and you have a whole bunch of cows that don't have calves. I also work with a lot of new farmers through a group called Young Agrarians, and I'm starting to hear more and more about the stress and mental health effects of climate change, where people, in the past, we used to hear from farmers that the stress was always around money. Now the stress is really around these climate events and just how it's affecting their farm and whether or not they can actually survive. So one of the things I just want to show quick, and then I'll pass it back to Blaine to get into some questions, is this is something that Blaine actually showed me, but I did it on my farm one day. So this is last year. The outside temperature, this is what happens on a 30-degree day. That's why I like to use that. What's going to happen on 30-degree days. So the temperature outside was 34.5 degrees. So if you think about that, how hot do you think that it would be at the soil surface where the plants are? So maybe just, think of a number in your head. So at the soil surface, the soil temperature was 65. So this actually represents a lot of what our traditional farming looks like. We keep the soil bare, either through chemicals or through tilling to keep the weeds down. And in that traditional thinking, that's what we want. We want this clean monoculture field where we can harvest it efficiently and kind of get it to market quickly so that we can get our inputs and equipment payments, loans paid off. It's surprising, even in a field where, you have like say corn planted or wheat planted, even in between the plants, there's still a lot of bare soil. And so the temperature is actually rising, is really hot. So what I did was I compared it to a place where I planted what's called a cover crop, and I'll explain that more. So this is where, there's some plants covering it. And this really like brought the soil temperature down to like 43 degrees. So we can do things that actually brings that soil temperature down. Now this was a little experiment in my garden. Farmers are actually doing this on a larger scale. So this is my partner Ted, and this is the first cover crop that we've grown on our farm. So this field before had been an oat field. And the soil wasn't super great. We were kind of trying to fix the soil basically. And so what we did the next year was, instead of planting another cash crop, we let the profit was like foregone, and decided to put in a cover crop. So we weren't going to make money off that field this year, but we decided that it was a year to make an investment in that soil health. So cover crops, they aren't just good for hot days, they're really great for the soil. In this crop, there was barley and rye and peas and hairy vetch and oats and corn and sunflowers. And, for those of you that might not know what all those things are, there was basically a lot of biodiversity of different kinds of plants in there, all serving different functions. And you can imagine the diversity of the roots below. And this, each one of those has a certain niche, and it's just building this biologically healthy soil. And one of the questions in this webinar was like, how do we finance the transition? So in this year, this was 2019, and we didn't get paid to put this in, but now there's a lot of like government grants and different groups who are helping farmers to put in cover crops. and helping to pay for these kinds of things so that it can help to kind of like make that transition and that risk less for the farmers. So yeah, I look forward to more of the conversation. I'll pass it back to you, Blaine.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you, Tony. So we're going to try and honor the 1 hour time limit that this webinar was set up for. So if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A there. There is one question right now which says that how much extra land would you need if we went to a fully regenerative system? And I guess I will just say that I don't believe you would need any extra land, that it will become more productive. And I don't know if Tony and Dana, I think you'd likely both agree with that.
I would agree with that. Certainly, our farm, I think, is far more productive than it was when it was growing a mediocre corn crop on rolling land and very little building of in fact, depletion of the soil. So I think that to me is what I find so exciting. I think the question came from Nikki Trudell, and Nikki, the thing to me is that if we move to regenerative agriculture, it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the farmer because you're actually making your farm better and more productive. And it's a win for the environment because you're increasing soil biodiversity. And once you do that, a lot of biodiversity above the soil comes into play. And from a municipal perspective, you're reducing the likelihood that you're going to contribute floodwaters to damage municipal infrastructure. Probably nutrient density in food will be going up. So there's just so many different ways that it's a win-win. And it doesn't require finding new planets on which to plant the trees that we're going to sequester carbon with tree planting. It doesn't involve, speculative inventions that somebody's going to have to invent and invest in to make this happen. It involves changing how we manage things. And that's one of the important things, I think, as we think about government program. It's not just helping farmers figure out what to do, but it's helping them understand why this is in their best interest, as well as their community and the environment's best interest, to make this transition. But I don't think it'll involve, desperately looking for more farmland. I think it actually may let us work with less farmland that we manage far more effectively. Dana.
Now let's jump to the next question. That was
okay. All right, we're getting questions here like crazy. So, what is a climate-friendly diet? Is it plant-based, mainly plant-based, and some meat? What kind of meat? Organic, free range only? Free range only? What species? Which ones? Etc. Would you like to tackle that one, Dana?
Sure. Can I tackle the one before it too?
Sure, yeah, sure.
The one before is what percentage of farmers in Canada are doing regenerative farming? I actually don't know the answer. It's
very small.
It's a very small percentage, but one of the reasons why I wanted to answer that is my work with new farmers. So we have there is a growing interest in people becoming farmers who haven't grown up on a farm. And many of them, the reason why they want to do it is because of ecological reasons. And so they're just primed to get into regenerative agriculture. They're looking to do those kinds of practices. So sometimes it's about thinking about the transition of existing farms from one system to the next, but sometimes it's also like, how do we just get these new farmers on farm and get them going on the kind of farming that they already want to do. And then the one on, sorry.
Well, I just want to jump in. The Ecological Farmers Association, when we started it nearly 50 years ago, was 15 farmers pooling their knowledge and information. Now that organization has over 500 members. So there is growing interest and growing awareness, but it's still a very small fraction at this point. And there's a huge vested interest in the input suppliers to maintain the status quo. So there are challenges in that transition. Back to you, Dana.
Yeah, the one on diet is a hard question to answer because and that's why Blaine is laughing, because I don't ever like to tell somebody how to eat. But I think that for me, it's less like about, the ethics of whether you are vegetarian or, you want to eat this or that or whatever. It's more like, how is that land managed? And I think the most climate friendly diet is knowing your farmer and knowing how they're managing things. So I know that if you're looking for different farms, like you want to build a relationship with a regenerative farmer, Regeneration Canada has a great map across Canada of different farms, and you can connect with a farm that way, and go out and visit a farm, take your kids. I think that's one of the best ways to start to think about, where do I get my food from, and how can I support a farmer who's actually doing this.
Thank you, Dana. I just have to answer that question too. I agree with Dana that I don't think it's our place to tell people how to eat, but I think it is our place to say how carbon friendly is the food you're eating. And is it actually putting carbon back into the soil? Are you regenerating the farmer? Are you regenerating the community, the ecosystem around us? I think that's absolutely critical that we answer that particular question. When you make your purchasing decisions, you need to ask yourself that question. And it may be very difficult if you live in the middle of a huge city and you don't have access to farmers markets, etc. But I believe that most of us are computer literate, and we can, as Dana just suggested, there's a couple of very good websites there that you can look out. The next question.
I'm going to
Tony.
share my screen, Blaine, if I could.
Yeah.
Here.
Okay.
Because I think that raises to me one of the really important aspects of what we're doing. And how are we going to finance this transition? We can talk about government stuff. We can talk about, but each of us individually makes some decisions each time we take a bite. And as you say, knowing where that food comes from and how it was raised, because there's a huge difference between industrial beef and grass-fed, range-fed beef. And same for all the livestock. And if your tofu came from soybeans that were part of clearing the Amazon, then they may not be as climate friendly as the beef that I'm moving onto a fresh piece of pasture every day. So it is complex. But the other thing I would say is on our little farm, we have customers in Toronto who get their meat from us. So if you live in a city, you can connect with people. But the other thing that I think is important about it is that we push that demand up the food chain or up the supply chain. So ask at the grocery store, is this product coming from a regenerative farm? And Blaine, I think you might just talk briefly about your experience with General Mills before we move on to other questions, because I think that's an important indication of the financing coming from the food system chain as opposed to from government intervention or individual effort. But I really think the individual has a very important role to play.
Yeah, we can be the best regenerative farmers in the world, and if you guys don't eat the food that we produce, we're wasting our time. So one of the things that I do as I've become semi-retired from farming, my son and daughter-in-law run the show now. So I started to work as sort of an agricultural coach, I guess. And General Mills, who are one of the large food corps of the world, they are very desirous of having farmers become more regenerative. And that may seem kind of weird that a big corp actually cares. But one of the things that's going to hit us about 2030 is called Scope 3 emissions. And it's going to change the world. Whether it's good or bad, I'm not sure, but it is going to change and it's going to happen. And so General Mills, when they buy oats from Tony or Dana or myself, they have to account for the carbon that I put into the fertilizer, all those things, if I grew those oats. So General Mills has to account for that. And so they say, well, I can't really do anything about it. So maybe we should be proactive and work with these farmers and make them, instead of growing carbon positive oats, let's grow carbon negative oats. And it's relatively easy to do. And so that's one of the jobs that I do is I work with about 50 farms kind of on a pilot project here in the Eastern Prairies. And we try and help these guys become more regenerative in their approach to growing cereal crops, so that instead of putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, we're actually starting to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that brings me to the next question that was asked: what is the single biggest impediment to stop the change? And I would say that there's two things. One is that compaction in the soil that I showed you a minute ago in those two circles. But the second one is the distance from right here, the compaction right there. And every one of us has that. And it's very, very difficult. There's peer pressure in communities. It's hard to make people change. It's sort of the old saying that, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But, you have to kind of foster the reasons, why it would be better if you did this. And it doesn't happen instantly. Every one of us has went through a transformation in our careers, and none of it happened quickly. But we've all managed to change. And so I guess that would be the answer. I don't know if Dana or Tony has anything to add to that.
Well, I jump in there. In the 70s, there was very little information on how to make an effective transition or a successful transition. And so we overcame that challenge by people sharing from their own experience. With the Ecological Farmers Association, farmers shared their successes and their failures, what had worked and what hadn't worked. And I think that aspect of peer support, not just peer pressure to stay as you are, but peer support to make changes and to have neighbors who are willing to show, or people at least in the larger community who are making these kind of changes, was really helpful to us. And I think that's where the continued networking with Farmers for Climate Solutions and our kind of mentorship programs and the mentorship programs of groups like Holistic Management Canada really can help people and support them as they try experiments. Because not everything you do is going to work out the way you wanted it to. And sometimes the thing that fails this year would have succeeded last year because the weather conditions were different. So we're in a very challenging time as farmers in terms of weather patterns and weather disruption. So peer support, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah, I think we spent so little time talking about this part of it, and in thinking about like policy recommendations and things like that. Like most of the money is spent on implementing or a training program. It's never spent on the social side of things, on how do we form these peer groups as farmers, or, how do we learn from each other, and that takes coordination, and how do we even understand what all of those social pressures are. So one time I was talking to a group of students at the U of M they were all like kind of like the sons and daughters of crop farmers. And it was like a typical university class where they were all kind of sitting back. They'd probably been out partying the night before. I was saying to them that at the end of the talk, I said, the challenge that we're facing is that we have to transition our farming practices for ecological and economic reasons, and we have to do that at the same time that we're transitioning the farm from one generation to the next. And they all woke up because I hit on their pain point. Many of those students would be going back to the farm to farm with their parents or take over the farm, and many of them might want to change practices, but it can be really hard if the whole family doesn't support it. So it's easy. Sometimes it's just easier to maintain status quo. And, we don't have like a bunch of studies that have figured out like what the social side of that is and how do we support behavior change to make the transition happen.
Good answer, Dana.
On this next question, Blaine,
Yep.
given that you don't turn the soil, how do you move from a cover crop year to a cash crop year?
Yep. Go for
There are
it.
several different ways. If you plant a fall cover crop that winter kills, you can plant directly into that stubble. And I did this with an oil radish crop one year. But you can also sometimes roll or crimp a crop, or you can graze off a cover crop. And if you graze it off, then you've in effect mown off the cover, left the roots in the soil, and now you could plant into it. So there are various ways you can terminate the cover crop without having to use a pesticide or an herbicide on it. So those, anyone else can add, but those are some that cross my mind.
Also, we have, sufficiently good enough equipment nowadays that it's basically like taking a butcher knife and making a slit in the soil and planting the seeds in it with virtually zero disturbance. It's almost impossible to see where that drill went when you look at the field. So, the technology is getting very good at placing seeds through the litter layer into the soil. Do you have anything to add to that, Dana?
No, you got it.
Okay. What's next here? Do we have data to support our contention that the amount of land to support regenerative agriculture is no more than what is required to support Do we have data for that? Well, I guess the first thing I would throw out is that, if we talk beef, which is my main area of expertise, we have over 40 million acres of corn that goes into the ethanol industry, which is really silly. And then we have another 40 million acres of corn that goes into the feedlot industry. And so if you just remove those two things, there you have 80 million acres of prime land in the I states, primarily Minnesota and a few other places that have the potential to grow food for people instead of for things that we don't really need. So there's a huge gain there. I guess, anecdotally, I would say that if you look at a garden on the prairies here, count the calories produced in that garden versus, say, a wheat field, a monoculture wheat field, or a monoculture canola field, garden wins every time, hugely. So, we need to change the way we think about how to do it. That argument does not fear me in any way at all. There's lots of land available for that.
Yeah, and I would also say, just from my own experience with our farm, it is producing so much more food and serving so many more customers. My daughter now has taken over from us. We have a small meat retail business, and we are serving far more customers than that farm ever fed when it was just producing a cash crop of field corn. And I think when farmers make the transition, they often find they can go to less land because their land is more productive and more economically productive, as well as more biologically productive. So, and if you look at any of the histories of peasant agriculture used land far more productively and intensively without destroying it, in terms of diverse multi-cropping systems and that. So we aren't going to starve the world if we move to regenerative agriculture. We might even save it from its current very desertification and destructive course.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add there, Dina?
Yeah, I was with some farmers yesterday that they, through proper planned grazing, you can actually really increase the amount of grass that you're growing. And so you can increase the amount of cattle that you can raise on that land. And, some say that you can do that up to 3 times as many cows as you currently have. And this farmer just had this realization that he's like, I don't need to buy another ranch. He's like, I can have 2 more ranches just by improving my grassland. And at the price of land right now, he was really happy about that.
Very good. Thank you. There's a couple more here we haven't quite answered. Okay, labeling. Is there labeling identifying regenerative products?
I can speak to that. So we're working on that at Holistic Management Canada. We're working with a group in the States on a label called Land to Market, and it's coming. It's like the markets in Canada, it's really difficult because there isn't a huge demand. Like the demand forces in the States are quite different. I went to a Whole Foods in the States, and every product had 8 labels on it. And here in Canada, we don't seem to do that quite as much, but I would say it's coming. And, in the next probably 5 years, we'll start to see more of that. And some of what Blaine is doing too, there'll be a label, I think, through that. We kind of, it's about the program is about going and monitoring the land. So we're basically measuring the ecosystem health of the land, and we want to see it improving year after year. And if the farmer can show that, then they're able to use that label on any product that comes from the farm. But at the same time, it's great because it's a really good education tool for the farmer to think about their management and know that they're actually improving the land year over year.
One of the keys is that every single label that I look at is, they say it's green, it's a green product, it's sustainable, all those words, which don't mean a single thing. And the key to what Dana just talked about, and the one that where I'm involved, they will actually be verifiable. There will be third-party auditing that will actually say that when you buy this particular product, you are actually supporting a regenerative farm that is doing good things for ecological goods and services and putting carbon back into the soil. That's what will be key. And that's going to take a while to kind of figure that one out, but it is coming, and many people are working on that.
I think in many ways, yeah. I mean, the organic label was an effort in that regard with a third-party certification. And the organic movement is what kept a lot of these ideas alive during the 50 to 75 years that we've had the push to industrial agriculture. So I don't want to downplay the value and the role of the organic label, but it also has been in some ways watered down significantly in terms of what it can be applied to. So that, I think, raises the issue of how we work to make real contact with farmers and to support these new labeling efforts that are trying to make sure that we're not just seeing greenwashing and that. So I do hope people will talk to their supermarket staff and say, you know, are you sure this is really going to be helping the land when I buy this product? Because that's what they need to hear to push it up the chain.
So one of the next questions was, what took us so long to change? And that's a very good question. I guess probably we didn't have enough knowledge. I wish that when I started farming 50 years ago that I would have known what I know now, and I would have been a lot different farmer. But it took me 25 years of going down the industrial path, realizing that it wasn't working. It probably took me 15 years before I started to say to myself, this isn't working. And it took me another 10 years before I had enough guts to make a change. But that's kind of the process that I think most of us have went through over the years. All of the early people that, that are my age that have made the changes, most of us have a very similar story that we weren't taught this stuff when we went through college. We didn't learn this. It was totally different.
Blaine, we were taught that it couldn't work, that you had to get with the program. What helped me was that there were some people who said, I don't like this program, and never got with it. So there were some older farmers in our ecological farmers group who never made the transition. We said, no, this worked for my parents and it's working for me, so I'm going to keep doing it. But there was a huge marketing program from the universities on out to get farmers to adopt modern to industrialize agriculture, to take a biological system and try and apply Ford Motor techniques to it. And we're going to be paying that price for a long time, because once people get hooked on it, it's very scary to risk getting off the inputs. To risk, am I going to go bankrupt? So transition programs that help farmers make that transition and perhaps share their risk or reduce their risk may be one of the important things to look at as we go forward in making the transition, as well as the peer support.
Okay, here's another question. Is it fair to assume that regenerative agriculture is capable of producing feed grains in sufficient quantities to support the demand for poultry and pork products? I'm assuming they're referring to CAFOs there.
I mean, I would say that I've heard from like big pork, basically. They're wanting to do this. They're wanting to figure out, like, the big companies they've kind of done a lot of work in figuring out how their supply chains can be net zero. But the one thing that they haven't figured out is what's happening on the farm. And so now they're taking the steps to really invest in changes on the farm. So I have heard conversations about them saying, how can we make the feed grains for our pork, poultry, whatever, regenerative, which is exciting. I mean, it puts pressure on farmers to start to think about meeting the demands of those markets. I think on a single farm scale, one of the things about still having livestock and grain together is that what we've found, at least, is that it makes our farm much more resilient. So if, we have a crop one year that we got hit with hail, and we couldn't take grain off of it, right? But then that ends up becoming a feed source for the cattle. So, there's systems like that that make redundancies, which nature has, nature builds in, that can kind of work for you as a regenerative farmer. And I would say that there's increasing pressure too or increasing demand for like pastured products, like pastured raised poultry or pastured raised pork, that I think are really exciting. And a lot of young farmers are actually getting into that because they can do it on a small scale and, figure out how to do it. So I think that might be how we start to address that issue.
I guess one of the problems that we have with the supermarket system that has evolved is that you have the convenience of having fresh chicken any day of the year that you want. And when we move to a more regenerative model, especially in our climate, we cannot grow chickens outside year round. So that means then that we have to figure out a system that either you don't eat chicken in the winter or you buy 20 chickens from us in the fall, put them in your freezer and eat chickens through the winter out of your freezer. That's how it has to evolve, because it's not feasible to grow pastured poultry in January in Saskatchewan.
Or Ontario. But that raises the issue of, well, when we started, we raised our own grain because there was no organic grain available. Now on our farm, we're buying in grain that's grown by other farmers. We're a very hilly farm, and it makes more sense to do it that way. But the thing is, we're going to need to move livestock out of confinement if we aren't going to have all the energy costs and the environmental costs of the pollution. Our pastured poultry, which move daily forward in a little poultry cage, create this flush of growth behind them from the nutrients that they've left on the land. So instead of being a waste problem, they're a fertility component of our operation. And the same with the pastured pigs. And so the ability to put fertility through the animal back onto the land is an aspect of that. But you also raise the question of, is this going to require a lot of chemical weed control? Well, a number of the people who have experimented with regenerative agriculture have found they've been substantially able to reduce the amount of herbicide required as they get their soil into a healthier condition. The other thing is scale makes a difference. If you're trying to farm 10,000 acres, or in our area, let's say 1,500 acres in Ontario, you're wanting to get on that land when it's not ready to be planted. And you're wanting to do stuff at the wrong moment. And so you're not getting fast germination. And then you're having to use herbicides to control weeds that are faster. So getting farms scaled back to where you can do things at the optimum time for the given task, whether it be planting or harvesting or whatever, becomes significant. We've scaled up agriculture to a point where it often isn't going to work biologically very effectively. But as I say, people have found that they can minimize herbicide use or eliminate herbicide use by how they manage. And if we're talking about cover crops, as I said, if you get them winter killed, they're not going to be a problem. They're going to be a effective mulch that's planted through by that drill that Blaine was talking about. Or if you roller crimp them, you can set them back so that they're not competitive with the thing you're doing. So there are a variety, or if you pasture it off and it's annual stuff that once pastured off isn't going to recover, then your crop can take off. So there are a lot of ways to do it that don't even require chemical burn off. Modern agriculture has become so dependent on Roundup or glyphosate as the cure-all for everything. It's a really serious challenge, but there are ways around it that can work.
Unfortunately, modern agriculture is an extremely intensive usage of fossil fuels. 10 calories in for 1 calorie out. It's not a very good, when my grandfather started 100 years, he used 0 calories, used sunshine, and all of the food was positive. So it's interesting how it goes, and now we're moving back the other way again. Well, we're coming up right on the hour now, and I told you at the beginning we try and respect that. So, Dana, you have 1 minute to kind of summarize anything you'd like?
Oh, I don't know. It's hard to summarize.
Okay, I'll let you think. Tony, well, I know.
Okay. Yeah. Time. Well, I think we've seen a real progression. we got physical with the plow and that, we got chemical with the herbicides and the pesticides. I think we're getting back to recognizing that agriculture is a biological process and that we need to figure out how to increase the life in agriculture. And if we do that well, we're going to be using the current carbon cycle, using sunshine to produce our crops, to enrich our soil through the photosynthetic system, rather than using fossil carbon, which is part of the destructive flow into the climate crisis. So, I think there's a lot of hope there, and the question is, can we get behind the hopeful side? And the solution is under our noses, in our mouth, and under our feet in terms of the soil. But we've got to get really focused on that, and focused on it both at the individual level, at the societal level, because there's stuff we can do at the societal level, but it's also stuff we can do individually, both talking to our friends and our neighbors, buy that good food, and then invite them in and share a meal with them, because we need to rebuild community around food and around a healthy environment.
Dana.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's doable and it's happening, which is also very inspiring. And that just the simple idea of starting to work with nature. I heard somebody say once, Wes Jackson, say that he's from the Land Institute in the States, and he said that a future farmer is going to look much more like a 17th century naturalist, where it's much more about going out onto the land and observing things and just taking it all in and kind of working from there, rather than trying to have this kind of dominating type mindset of like, we're going to make this land do this. So I think it's really hopeful, and it's a very exciting space to be in.
Well, thank you, Tony and Dana, for your passion and your wisdom and sharing this webinar. And I'd just like to say that the solution to climate is the overreaching goal, I guess, that this webinar was probably sponsored for. And the green plant is the key to the solution. If we can re-green the world, we don't need to worry about carbon dioxide emissions nearly as much. Water vapor controls 95% of the heating and cooling. And if we get it greener, we're going to be better off. Find some food that's growing regeneratively. That would be my advice. If you want more information, probably one of the best sources would be watch the movie on Netflix called Kiss the Ground. Kiss the Ground. Excellent movie that talks about the whole process of regenerative agriculture. So I would encourage all of you to watch that. So thank you very much for participating this evening, and find some regenerative food and enjoy it. Back to you, Roy.
Well, thank you so much to all three of our speakers, Blaine, Tony, and Dana, for inspiring us not only through fantastic hope, but through realistic example. I mean, these things actually work. And you just have to find ways of moving those in mainstream, big industrial agriculture over to your side of the camp. And once we're there, well, that's our destination.
Well, Roy, can I just put in a further plug for Farmers for Climate Solutions? And this group coalesced and came together, and then went with some proposals to try and look at nitrogen usage, which is a huge energy source. And so we persuaded the federal government to bring in a program to help farmers reduce and make more rational their nitrogen usage. We brought in one to encourage more grazing and support fencing and other stuff. And I'm actually talking to you from a farm that converted cash crop land last year into land that's now being grazed by livestock and fenced and has perennial hay and pasture on it as part of that program. And then another aspect of it is a cover crop program to help. As Dana said, she didn't get that help because she and her husband were on the leading edge of that in Manitoba, but there are these programs. So there is stuff happening as part of the On-Farm Climate Action Fund that's helping farmers and encouraging farmers to make these transitions. So there's stuff happening out there, and we need to keep encouraging it, but we'll also recognize that as we get fossil fuel pricing more realistic and more reflective of its true costs, that will impact this industrial agriculture significantly, as long as we don't say agriculture is so important, we're going to exempt it from those costs, because then it further subsidizes those folks at the expense of regenerative farmers. So those are some key things to keep in mind. But I'll shut up. My wife always says, time, Tony.
Okay, what a great note on which to end. Thank you very much to all three of you, and thank you to all our listeners, and we welcome your feedback. If you have any, just let us know, and we'll see you at our forthcoming webinars that I mentioned earlier in the program. Thanks to all, and take care.